I moved into the small cottage on the edge of the valley specifically because it felt like a secret. It was a modest, weathered cedar shingle house that sat at the very end of a long, gravel driveway, tucked behind a thick curtain of ancient oaks and weeping willows. To most people, it probably looked like a fixer-upper in a neighborhood that had outgrown it. But to me, it was a sanctuary. I'd spent the last decade working a high-stress corporate job in a city that never slept, and the silence of the valley was the first thing that had made me feel like I could actually breathe in years. But there was a catch, or what some would call a catch. My property didn't just end at the tree line. It extended down a gentle slope into a lush, vibrant meadow that bordered a state-protected wetland. When I bought the place, the deed came with a thick folder of environmental easements. I wasn't allowed to build on the lower 4 acres. I couldn't mow the tall grass during nesting season, and I certainly couldn't use pesticides. To me, that wasn't a burden. It was a privilege. I shared my backyard with blue herons, foxes, and a pair of nesting bald eagles that lived in a massive snag near the creek. It was perfect until the morning I met Brenda. Brenda was the self-appointed queen of the Oak Valley Homeowners Association. Now, my house was technically part of the HOA, but because it sat on the historical fringe of the development, I had mostly been left alone for the first year. That changed on a Tuesday in late May. I was sitting on my back porch with a cup of coffee, watching the morning mist rise off the meadow, when I saw a bright, white SUV pull up to the edge of the gravel. A woman climbed out, dressed in a crisp, salmon-colored tracksuit, and clutching a clipboard like it was a holy relic. She didn't knock on my door. Instead, she marched straight past my porch and began pacing out the distance from my fence line to the meadow. I walked down the steps, feeling that familiar tightening in my chest that usually preceded a headache. I asked her if I could help her with something. She didn't even look up at first, just scribbled something on her board and then gestured broadly at the tall, swaying wildflowers and the dense brush of the wetlands. She told me, not asked me, that the overgrowth was a blight on the community's aesthetic standards. She said the HOA board had been receiving complaints about the unmaintained field and that they had decided this area would be the perfect site for the upcoming Midsummer Community Picnic and Founders Day Gala. I was stunned. I tried to explain as calmly as I could that the land wasn't unmaintained. It was a protected habitat. I told her about the easements and the wildlife. Brenda just gave me a look of pure, filtered condescension, the kind of look you give a child who is trying to explain why they didn't finish their vegetables. She told me that protected was a flexible term when it came to property values and that the HOA had jurisdiction over the visual harmony of the neighborhood. She informed me that a landscaping crew would be arriving on Friday to level the weeds and prepare the ground for a large marquee tent and several dozen picnic tables. I felt a surge of genuine panic. If they brought heavy machinery into that meadow, they wouldn't just be cutting grass. They'd be destroying a delicate ecosystem that had taken decades to stabilize. I tried to show her the paperwork, but she waved it away, saying she didn't have time for technicalities and that the community's social calendar took precedence over a few bugs and some muddy water. Wednesday and Thursday were a blur of frantic phone calls. I reached out to the HOA board president, only to find out he was Brenda's brother-in-law. I called the local municipal office, but they told me that unless work had actually started, there wasn't much they could do about a dispute over lawn maintenance. I felt like I was screaming into a vacuum. Every time I looked out at the meadow, I saw the eagles circling overhead, and my heart sank. Friday morning arrived with the roar of a flatbed truck. 2 men hopped out and began unloading industrial-sized brush mowers. Brenda was there too, wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat and directing them toward the meadow like she was overseeing the construction of Palace. I ran out, standing between the mowers and the tall grass. I told them they were trespassing on private property and violating state environmental laws. The workers looked uncomfortable, but Brenda stepped forward, her face turning a mottled shade of red. She screamed that I was being obstructionist and that the HOA had the right to abate any nuisance that threatened the collective enjoyment of the residents. She told the men to keep going, claiming she would take full responsibility for any minor fines. That was the moment I realized I couldn't fight her with logic or neighborly appeals. I needed the big guns. While the workers were debating whether to actually run me over, I ducked back inside and made one final call. I didn't call the police, and I didn't call a lawyer. I called the State Department of Environmental Protection's Wildlife Division and the Regional Office of the Fish and Wildlife Service. I had spoken to a ranger there months ago when I first moved in, just to clarify the boundaries of the eagle nesting site. I got lucky. The ranger I had spoken to, a no-nonsense man named Miller, was in the area. He told me to stay put and not to let them touch a single blade of grass. Back outside, the tension was thick enough to cut. Brenda was berating the workers for their hesitation, accusing them of being lazy. Just as one of the men started the engine of his mower, a dark green truck with official state emblems pulled into the driveway, followed shortly by a second vehicle from the Federal Fish and Wildlife Agency. Ranger Miller stepped out, looking every bit the authority figure in his uniform and campaign hat. Brenda, apparently thinking she could charm her way out of this, marched over to him with a practiced smile. She started explaining that they were just doing some light grooming for a community event. Miller didn't smile back. He didn't even acknowledge her at first. He walked past her, straight to the edge of the meadow, and looked up at the snag where the eagles were perched. Then he turned to the landscapers and told them that if they moved those machines 1 inch closer to the tall grass, he would have them in handcuffs before the sun hit its zenith. The look on Brenda's face was something I will cherish for the rest of my life. Her mouth hung open, her composure shattering like cheap glass. She tried to argue, mentioning the HOA bylaws and the Founders Day Gala, but Miller wasn't interested. He pulled out a map and a thermal imaging device. He explained to Brenda, and the now terrified workers, that this wasn't just unmaintained land. This was a designated critical habitat for several endangered species, including a specific type of ground nesting bird that was currently in peak breeding season. Furthermore, the bald eagle nest was protected under the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, a federal law with teeth that didn't care about neighborhood picnics. He informed her that even the noise from the mowers could be considered harassment of a protected species, a federal offense that carried massive fines and potential jail time. Brenda tried to pivot, claiming she didn't know, but Miller wasn't having it. He pointed out that the property was clearly marked with state conservation boundary markers, small, metal discs that Brenda had apparently ignored or tried to hide. He then turned his attention to me, but his tone was much softer. He thanked me for the call and told me that he would be filing a formal report of the attempted violation. Then, he turned back to Brenda and told her that the HOA was now under a cease and desist order for any activity involving this parcel of land. He added that if so much as a folding chair was placed in that meadow for a picnic, he would personally ensure the HOA faced the maximum penalty, which could easily reach 6 figures. The landscapers didn't wait to be told twice. They reloaded their equipment and sped off as fast as their truck would allow. Brenda stood in my driveway, her salmon tracksuit now looking wilted and ridiculous against the backdrop of the wild, indomitable meadow. She tried to muster one last bit of defiance, muttering something about legal counsel and community standards, but she looked small. For the first time, she wasn't the queen of the valley. She was just a person who had tried to pave over something beautiful because she couldn't control it. The Founders Day Gala ended up being held in a sterile, paved parking lot behind the community center. I heard through the grapevine that the HOA board was furious with Brenda for exposing them to federal scrutiny. Her influence began to wane after that. Her visual harmony campaigns replaced by a sudden, nervous silence. As for me, I went back to my porch. The eagles stayed in their nest, and a few weeks later, I saw the first fledglings testing their wings. The meadow grew tall and unruly, filled with the hum of insects and the scent of damp earth and wildflowers. It wasn't neat, and it wasn't manicured, but it was alive. I realized then that sometimes the best way to protect your home isn't to build higher fences, but to let the wild things have their space. There's a certain peace that comes from knowing you stood up for something that couldn't speak for itself. And as I watched the sun set over the protected land, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. The silence of the valley was deeper now, not because there was less noise, but because the tension was gone, replaced by the quiet, steady pulse of a world that didn't need a clipboard to tell it how to grow. In the end, Brenda didn't just lose her picnic spot. She lost the illusion that her rules were more important than the ancient laws of the land. And every time I hear the cry of the eagle from the high snag, I'm reminded that some things are worth fighting for, especially the things that are too wild to be owned. Would you like me to develop a follow-up story about how the neighborhood reacted or create a similar HOA conflict script involving a different environmental issue?